Hello again, and welcome to the Temporal 3 podcast. Today, we're going to talk all about fire alarm. I am joined by my co host, Mr. Charles Aulner. Hello, Charles.
Hello. Hi.
And Mr. Chris Godwin.
Hello.
Well, guys, I'd like to start out today talking about a topic that certainly is a relatively simple topic, but does cause a lot of confusion with fire alarm people, and that is the 3 dB and 6 dB rules. Chris, talk to us a little bit about the 3 dB and 6 dB rules. What are they?
We use these rules to help establish the spacing of our audible appliances. Now, all audible is going to use a 6 dB rule for figuring out your distancing, your spacing. It's based off of the inverse square law, which states every time you double the distance away, you lose 6. And you just keep doubling until you are within your required sound level, whether that's public mode or 15 dB above or your private mode 10 dB above. Doubling the spacing until you get 15 or 10 above the ambient sound level. 3 dB rule is for speakers, only speakers. And what the 3 dB rule states is every time you double power to the speaker, you will gain 3 dB more. 3 dB rule is used to establish the baseline of what the appliance is going to produce. The problem is out in the field, and especially with design, it doesn't get used that often because of combination devices, combination appliances, your horn strobes, your speaker strobes, where the limiting factor is never what is the audible doing. It's always going to be, the visible side of it. So that's a big thing that when you get into like the NICET exam, people struggle with that for a bit until they finally get comfortable with it, and then they get the ball rolling and have an understanding. But it is just one of those things that I've seen from students that, they'll tell me, I've been doing design for a while, never had to use this. Most our designs are going to be combination devices, so it doesn't get used that much.
Charles, what's your take on this?
Well, expanding on what Chris said, it's a legacy issue. Back in the day, many, many, many years ago, several decades ago, strobes were expensive. Horns were less expensive. So using a combination device wasn't as common as it is now. So what you would do is you'd figure out how many strobes you needed and how many horns you needed, and they were considered separate, really. Nowadays, we just stick a horn strobe up wherever we need to. So the 6 dB and the 3 dB rule is less important in terms of spacing now than it used to be. We really had to do the calculation back in the day when they were considered separate. Nowadays, the strobe is always the factor because the horn sounds loud enough with the spacing of the strobes. We don't have to worry about the decibels so much. Brian?
I hadn't even considered that. You're absolutely right, because you think about it, I'm old enough to remember the 1992 ADA law that completely turned fire alarm up on its head. And where previously we had basically white strobes that said fire on them, and all of a sudden this ADA law comes out, and everybody's producing these 117 candela strobes that draw like 250 milliamps, and there's all kinds of requirements. And then of course 72 evolved to add those tables and stuff like that. And you're right, way back when we just used those basic, not very high intensity strobes, it's basically a flashing light. It was a lot easier back then, certainly. But with the visual intensity requirements, the visual requirements being added to the code based on the ADA law, that kind of turned things on its head. I never really considered it from that perspective. I think you're right about it. So, Chris, you mentioned about in the real world, in design, you and I both, and particularly you, have experience with a couple of design programs. Have you found any design programs that'll do these 3 dB or 6 dB calculations for you?
There's nothing that I've found. No, this is something that as a designer, you got to know how to do. It's not like the software is going to do it for you. Now, like we were saying, horn strobes, speaker strobes, they've taken this out of the field. They've taken it maybe not completely out of the field, because you still want to make sure that you are going to be at least 15 above. But for the most part, it's not something that a lot of designers are really using, and it's one of those things that really bites them in the back end when it comes to testing, when it comes to, hey, this isn't producing enough. What do you mean
Right,
it's not
right.
producing? They've got they're overlapping coverage all over. How is it not? Well, you didn't calculate.
Yep. You have a high ambient noise area and your coverage of the audible gets reduced, then it really becomes an issue. And that's something people don't necessarily consider. Charles, from the NICET perspective, is this something you think people will see on the NICET exam?
Likely, yes, especially at level 3 and 4. This is something that
Absolutely.
NICET likes to throw in there. It's a calculation. It's something that uh, I'm going to say this, although it's my perception, not necessarily NICET's reality, that they seem to want to make things difficult and confusing on the test. And this is an area that they can really accomplish that. Um, One thing I'll say about it too, and I think it's important, is this is Annex A type material. The 3 dB rule and the 6 dB rule are for design guidance purposes only. If you really want to make sure that your devices are going to function the way that they're intended, what do we have to do?
Get out there and measure it.
Yeah, we have to use a sound meter. Get out there and follow the requirements of the code, set that thing up for 24 hours, see what the average ambient and maximum sound levels are,
Right.
base it on what's actually happening on the ground.
Absolutely. That's an interesting take on it too, because you're right. That is really the crux of it. You know, these if you have a high ambient noise level, even though you have design guidance, you talked about it being in Annex A, but again, it is design guidance, just like they provide design guidance for average ambient sound levels in Annex A as well in 18 A1844. Yeah, A1844. But it's only, as you said, Charles, guidance. It is not necessarily reality, and the reality in the field is what makes that determination. It means whether or not the AHJ that comes in there. I used to say Radio Shack. Nobody knows who Radio Shack is anymore. Uh, Amazon special DB meter and says, okay, 5 feet off the floor, you're not meeting the sound level requirements. Fail. You got to add horns. The other thing I was going to say about that too is something that we need to consider is that audible notification design is performance based, not prescriptive. That basically the code doesn't tell us how far apart to put the horns. It says you got to meet this dB level. Strobes are prescriptive. We know what the strobe requirements are based on the size of the room and location and intensity of the strobe. But audibles, I hate to say a crapshoot, but they really are a crapshoot. That sometimes, if you don't plan ahead, if you don't plan properly, you could end up basically having to add more audibles. So, yeah, definitely an interesting topic. So, if I'd like to turn next to code. I'd like to talk about a favorite code of ours, NFPA 70, the National Electrical Code, the code of the electricians, shall we say, but that does have a bearing on the work we do in fire alarm systems. And Article 760 really is the heart of the matter for fire alarm people. And Article 760 is actually broken into 4 parts. And I don't think a lot of people realize this when they work in Article 760. And knowing that it's broken into parts can actually help you navigate it, even though it is only about 10 pages. Not a lot to work with, but it is something that's going to be on your NICET exam. We have to have familiarity with it in the real world for those discussions with the AHJ. And the parts are Part 1 for general requirements, Part 2 for non-power limited fire alarm, Part 3 for power limited fire alarm, and Part 4 for listing. But I'd like to focus today on Part 1, some of the general requirements. So, Chris, what do we find in Part 1? What are we going to see in there?
A lot of repetition from chapter 3, honestly. But you are going to have stuff that is very specific to your fire alarm systems, your fire alarm system wiring. You don't have to have it in conduit, but it does have to be in enclosures if you're going to be doing any kind of splices. Anything that's going to be a break in the circuit, in the wire itself, has to be in a box or enclosure. That's something that is specific to 760.
Chapter
And
1. or part one. Yep.
Yeah, right there at the beginning of part one, it gives you that information. Protection of the circuit. Also, one other thing is lightening. What we like to talk about is lightening the fire load of the building. You got abandoned cable, it's got to be removed. You've got you're going through any kind of fire or smoke barriers, it's got to be sealed back up. And a lot of that information is right there at the beginning of 760.
Charles, what's your favorite part of 760 part one? Do you
Well,
have a favorite?
Chris hit it, and I think this is really important from an understanding the perspective point of view. The abandoned cable issue, it's got to be removed. But who's responsible for removing it becomes the big question. As a fire alarm technician, if you observe abandoned cable, does that make it your responsibility to take that out? And uh, obviously, the answer is no. The code says it has to be removed. Does it say it has to be removed for free?
No.
No, it doesn't. And Brian, who's responsible for removing that cable?
Whoever the AHJ says. And ultimately it's the building owner, but the
The building
AHJ
owner.
can,
Yeah.
yeah, the
Yeah,
building, the
yeah.
AHJ can point the finger at whoever he wants. And it's an interesting topic of discussion because we've heard from a lot of fire alarm people. Yeah, I got hung with removing abandoned cabling, and most build a T&M requirement into their contracts for abandoned cable. But here's the quandary of the fire alarm people: we are the last trade in there. We're after the HVAC people and the painters and the plumbers and the electricians. And the building can't open without our system. Fire alarm's not complete, building's not opening. So the AHJ a lot of times will pick on us and say, hey, you're the last trade. You're the guy within my field of vision. You're removing it. And it definitely presents a challenge.
And
One of
then
my,
there's
go ahead, Chris or
another
Charles.
part of that too, Brian, that I think is really important. As that wire load increases in a building, sure, there's a fuel for the fire argument, but there's something else that happens too. And that is when the drop ceiling falls in a real fire, what's all that cable doing?
Yep. Yeah, it's coming down on whoever's in the building.
And it's
Yep.
happened that firefighters get tangled up in that spider web of abandoned cable or cabling, and it's a real hazard for our first responders. So, making sure that our cable is properly secured and abandoned cabling is removed becomes a safety issue for firefighters.
So I got to tell you guys what my favorite part of Article 760 Part 1 is, and the one that I see so many pictures and so many uh hear so many horror stories about, and you guys know where I'm going with this. Neat and workmanlike manner. My personal favorite is hearing stories or seeing pictures of the fire alarm panel or any panel. The guy opens the cabinet door and a cascade of wire falls at his feet. And that one is just a personal pet peeve of mine, that thinking about technicians and the amount of time that it takes to deal with and sort through that mess. And neat and workmanlike manner is not defined in 70. So that becomes the domain of the AHJ, and it's up to the AHJ to enforce that neat and workmanlike manner of installation of the system. If you guys have experience with that, have you guys seen that, particularly from your field experience? Rat's nest?
Definitely seen plenty of rat's nest. A lot of times it's above the ceiling, like we were talking about, but I've had plenty of panels where I opened up and I was like, why am I getting smacked in the face? This is not right. What's going on here? Or I've got to pull the knacks off, and there's no way to get your hand in there without getting bit by the animal that is all of that wire that's just been, yeah, push it in. It's fine. Just get it in there and be done with it. No, it's got to be done in a neat and workmanlike manner. Unfortunately, there's not an elaboration on what that means, but it's in the code. It's in the code. But also in the code is that your fire alarm cable has to be read
Yeah, exactly.
760.30. I mean, the words don't say it.
He has to Da Vinci code it.
You got to read it between the lines. 760.30 basically, tells us, and this is right at the beginning, getting into that, part one. Your fire alarm circuit has to be identified at all junction and terminal locations.
Absolutely.
The word read somewhere in there. You just got to
Oh
read it.
yeah. Like I said, you got to Da Vinci code it. You
Yep.
got to call
Well-
Tom Hanks and read diagonally across multiple lines.
Yeah.
You were saying, well, Charles?
I just want to make sure everybody realizes that Chris is full of malarkey when he says that, because it came across as maybe that's true. It's not true, people.
That's not true
Fire
at
alarm
all.
cable doesn't have to be red.
Yes, if you're listening.
We bring that up in class, and I'll read the entire reference, and I'll tell everyone, see, it says right there. Everyone's lost. And then I have my favorite joke of all time, where I actually highlight across 3 different lines in one paragraph. No, it doesn't say anything about it has to be read. It doesn't have to be read. It has to be identifiable. It has to be identifiable at all terminal and junction locations. That's all code says about it. But you ask most of your AHJs, and code says it's got to be read. That's not accurate.
Just in case those of you that are listening only and not seeing the expression on Chris's face when he tells his story, as Charles confirmed, no, it does not actually say red.
Nope. Nowhere.
Well, guys, our question from the field for this session is about high air movement. Student asks, what is high air movement and how does it impact smoke detector spacing? Chris, what is high air movement and what does it do to smoke detector spacing?
If you have high air movement that's greater than 300 minutes per air change or per change, it's going to have an effect. What a smoke detector is looking for is smoke. Smoke is essentially weightless, and if you have air blowing the smoke all over the place, it's not going to be able to get to the detector in the way that we need it to. So when we have areas with high air movement, you got to adjust the spacing so you have more detection. You have more detection so that when that air pushes your smoke in a different direction, it's going to another detector. It's not going off towards the wall, away from it. It's going to be going and blowing towards another detector. So when we look at that, that's what we're trying to do. It affects the spacing because it's going to push my smoke away. So,
and in NFPA 72 and 17.7, 1777331 particularly talks about 8 minutes per change or 7.5 changes per hour. And there's a table that shows the spacing of the detectors. It also notes that does not apply to underfloor or above ceiling spaces as well. So if you're underfloor detectors, above ceiling, or mechanical rooms are exempt from this requirement. Not a common thing. Don't see a lot of areas where you have that high air movement, but is that something you may see on the NICET exam, Charles?
Absolutely. And there are some applications for this. I'll throw out a couple of concepts. One is garage, where mechanics work and they have vehicles running in an enclosed space. They set up air movement in those spaces to push out that exhaust air and bring fresh air in. Another
Right.
one, Chris, you're really familiar with, being a Las Vegas native. Those casinos, or some of them, allow smoking, and they have specific air movement in those spaces to push out that smoke and keep it fresh on the casino floor so people aren't offended by that smoking residue, so to speak. And when you have higher air movement in areas like that, hey, we have to reduce our smoke detector spacing in order to compensate.
yeah. That table doesn't really tell you exactly information. That table's a frustration because it tells you what your square footage coverage is with the table. First time I saw that, I was like, okay, so I'm using 125 feet now. What is going on? I don't understand. How do we go from 30 to 125? That's not how that works. You got to figure out what the square root is, and then that's what your spacing is. But code doesn't really stipulate how to do that. It just says, here's your information. Good luck.
When
So you're
the
saying the
board
code is
of
confusing.
directors at NICET see this podcast, and hear about your confusion, they're going to say, yes, mission accomplished.
What we wanted the whole time.
I'll tell you one that I considered. Again, it's not real common, but something that's been in the news a lot lately. So think it makes a great example is data centers. And it's not the subfloor, it's not the below floor detection or the above ceiling detection. It's in the data center themselves and servers. And if you have detection in the servers, if you're using spot type or if you're using air sampling type, and air sampling type usually is spaced the same as spot type, 30 feet. You have a high amount of air movement in the data center and you have smoke detection in the servers. You're going to have to put those holes closer together, put those detectors closer together based upon the amount of air movement. It does come into play. It's not a common thing. It's definitely a higher level thing, particularly in the NICET exam, but something to be aware of nonetheless. And as Chris said, the way the table's written, very, very confusing, and requires you to think a little bit and do a little bit of math. But does NICET love confusing stuff, guys?
Yeah,
Yes,
absolutely.
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, gentlemen, I appreciate the conversation today. As always, interesting and informative. I want to thank all of our listeners for joining us in the podcast. Please remember to subscribe. And guys, have a great rest of your day.
You too, Bryan.
Have a good one, Bryan.